You've been working hard and saving silver coins, trusting the face of the king stamped on the metal. But when you go to buy bread, the merchant demands twice as many coins as last year. Why? Because the king secretly melted down the treasury, mixed the silver with cheap copper, and printed millions of counterfeit coins to pay for his foreign wars. This is the Great Tudor Debasement, and it is exactly how modern inflation steals your labor today. England in the mid-1540s did not experience monetary failure as a theory. It experienced it as a betrayal. A man could still hold the same coin in his hand. The same king stared back at him. The same law called it money. But inside that coin, the substance was changing. Silver that had anchored trust in English money for generations was being stripped out and replaced, while the crown went on spending as if nothing had happened. That is the first lesson. Monetary corruption rarely arrives looking like collapse. It arrives looking like continuity. The stamp remains. The slogans remain. The social value remains. What disappears is the thing that made the money trustworthy in the first place. By 1544, Henry VIII's government had already squeezed taxation, borrowed heavily, and torn through one of the greatest asset seizures in English history. Still, it was not enough. War with France and Scotland was expensive. Prestige was expensive. Prestige was expensive. Maintaining the image of strength was expensive. And when a ruler runs out of assets to seize, he does not become disciplined. He reaches for the measuring stick itself. So this is not really a story about coins. It is a story about what happens when the state decides your wages are easier to dilute than its own ambitions. Historical calibration for the mechanism and timeline in this opening. The Great Debasement began under Henry VIII in 1544 amid war finance pressures. Silver coinage was progressively reduced from the old sterling standard, and the broader debasement continued into Edward VI before reversal in 1551. To understand why the crown corrupted the coinage, you have to begin with the appetite of the Tudor state. Henry VIII did not debase the money because he misunderstood economics. He debased it because he needed revenue faster than the kingdom could produce it honestly. War against France was ruinously expensive. War against Scotland was ruinously expensive. Fortifications, artillery, ships, garrisons, transport, powder, mercenaries, victualling, diplomatic display, court magnificence, and the theater of royal power all had to be funded in real time, not in theory. The state's problem was not desire, it was cash flow, and this is where modern viewers often miss the real pattern. Governments almost never arrive at currency corruption first. They move in stages. First they tax, then they borrow, then they seize, then they revalue. Only after those doors narrow do they tamper with the unit itself. In Tudor England, one of the largest emergency measures was the dissolution of the monasteries. From the late 1530s, the crown seized monastic lands, plate, rents, and movable wealth on an extraordinary scale. For a moment, this looked like abundance. A government drowning in liabilities suddenly had a mountain of assets to sell, redistribute, and consume. But that windfall created a dangerous illusion. It solved a liquidity crisis without solving the underlying spending habit that caused the crisis in the first place. That distinction matters. A one-time seizure can fill the treasury. It cannot permanently fund a regime committed to structural overspending. Once the lands are sold, once the silver is melted, once the plate is gone, the old arithmetic returns. Armies still have to be paid. Foreign campaigns still have to be supplied. The court still has to project strength. The bills keep arriving after the loot is exhausted, so the forensic sequence is brutally simple. First, the crown consumed inherited wealth. Then it consumed confiscated wealth. Then it approached the edge that every overextended state eventually reaches. When there is nothing politically easy left to take in visible form, the next target is invisible. The ruler steals not another estate, not another abbey, Not another chapel bell, but the integrity of the money itself. That is the pattern, interrupt hidden inside Tudor history. When a king runs out of things to steal, what does he do? He steals the value of the measure by which every worker, farmer, widow, mason, and soldier is paid. And once the state discovers it can do that, the damage spreads far beyond the mint. It enters every market stall in the kingdom. The crown had reached the point where taxes hurt, confiscation had already been used, and war still needed feeding. So the next operation moved behind the walls of the mint. This is where the story stops being political theater and becomes forensic metallurgy. Before the debasement, English silver coinage stood at the old sterling standard, about 92. 5% fine. That standard carried memory inside it. People did not trust a coin because they loved the king. They trusted it because repeated use had taught them that the metal was really there. Henry's government attacked exactly that layer of confidence. Beginning in 1544, silver content was cut sharply, and over the following years the standard fell in stages until some issues were reduced to a fraction of their former purity, with copper used to bulk out the coin while the face value remained legally intact. The state had discovered a way to stretch bullion without admitting insolvency, and that is the mechanism modern audiences need to hold on to. Debasement is not merely making cheaper coins. It is the conversion of trust into revenue. If 1 pound weight of silver once produced a limited number of honest coins, and now that same silver can be diluted with base metal and struck into far more units with the same stamped authority, the crown has effectively created purchasing power by falsifying the measuring instrument. Soldiers can still be paid. Suppliers can still be paid. Debts can still be settled in nominal terms, but the receiver is no longer being paid in the same substance. He is being paid in a claim that has been quietly degraded. The testoon became one of the clearest symbols of the fraud. It carried the king's portrait boldly enough, but the coin's dignity was skin deep. The base pieces were struck with increasing copper content and then given a surface wash of silver so they would pass more easily in circulation. For a while, the deception worked because ordinary exchange happens fast. Most people do not assay every coin. They spend under legal compulsion and social habit. But circulation is a brutal auditor. Hands rub. Pouches scrape. Market use reveals what proclamations try to hide. The silver coating wore away first at the highest point of the design, Henry's nose. And there, literally on the face of sovereign power, the copper underneath began to show. That is how a monetary crime became public knowledge. That is how Henry VIII became Old Coppernose. Notice what happened here. The public did not need a treasury report. They did not need an economist. They only needed worn coins and rising prices. The lie became visible when daily life performed the assay. Once the fraud became visible, the next stage was automatic. People changed their behavior. That is the point where a debasement stops being a mint policy and becomes a social event. The crown could still declare values by law. It could still stamp the king's face on the coin. It could still insist that a debased shilling and an older, heavier shilling were to be accepted at the same nominal rate. But ordinary people are not stupid. Once they realize two coins carry the same legal value but not the same real value, they do what human beings have always done. They spend the worse one first and hide the better one. This is the behavior later associated with Sir Thomas Gresham, though the pattern itself is older than Gresham. In Tudor England, the practical effect was clear enough. Better silver disappeared from circulation. It was hoarded, melted, exported, or withdrawn from ordinary exchange, while the inferior coin remained in the market. Bad money drives out good is not magic. It is simply what happens when the law pretends unequal things are equal, and the public notices before the state admits it, and now the damage compounds. Because once the good coin retreats, the market is left with a higher concentration of false measure. The average quality of circulating money falls. Trust falls with it. Merchants become more suspicious. Prices become less stable. Anyone receiving payment in coin has to make a quiet calculation. How much of this is real silver and how much is painted authority? That uncertainty does not stay inside bullion markets. It leaks outward into bread, ale, wool, meat, rents, transport, and wages. Notice the cruelty of the sequence. The politically connected often adapt first. Large merchants reprice. Bullion dealers discriminate. Better informed households sort their coin. But wage earners, servants, day laborers, and small market participants are usually trapped longest inside the official fiction. They are paid in the medium last to be trusted and spent into prices that adjust faster than their earnings do. That is how monetary corruption becomes class warfare without ever announcing itself as such. It does not arrive saying, "We are cutting your wages." It arrives saying, "The coin is still the coin." The Tudor state had discovered something enduring. You can force acceptance for a while, but you cannot force confidence. A government can command nominal circulation. It cannot command private belief forever. And once belief breaks, the economy splits in two. One price exists in law. Another exists in reality. For the working poor, the debasement did not feel like a debate about metallic standards. It felt like falling behind while doing everything the same. You still worked. You still showed up. You still accepted coin and payment because the law said it was money. But the basket of life pulled away from you anyway. Grain, bread, ale, meat, fuel, rent, cloth, candles, and tools did not ask what the proclamation said. They responded to shortage, distrust, war demand, and the declining credibility of the coin itself. Historians still debate the exact weight of debasement versus harvest failure, population growth, and the broader 16th century price revolution, but they do not debate the lived result. Mid-Tudor inflation bit hardest where income was least flexible, and contemporaries linked the debased coinage with the rise in prices. That is the real social violence of corrupted money. Nominal wages can remain stable while real wages collapse. A mason or laborer may receive the same count of coins, yet command less bread, less meat, less fuel, and less margin for illness or bad weather. The loss is easy for governments to hide because the worker appears, on paper, still employed and still paid. But payment is not the same as preserved labor. When the measuring unit is degraded, the worker is forced to absorb the difference between legal fiction and market reality. And that is why debasement is never evenly distributed. Large merchants can reprice. Landholders may benefit from rising nominal receipts. Those with inventories, export access, or political proximity can adjust earlier. But servants, wage laborers, pensioners, and households with little stored surplus are the slowest to adapt. They cannot hoard better coin at scale. They cannot negotiate faster than the market moves. They discover too late that the state's financing solution has become their household crisis. By the end of this process, the issue is no longer merely Tudor. It becomes universal. When money is corrupted, the first thing destroyed is not wealth in the abstract. It is the bridge between effort and survival. And once that bridge breaks, people do not become poorer only in arithmetic. They become more dependent, more fragile, and easier to govern through scarcity. So what is the survival lesson? Not buy whatever went up last year. Not panic. Not predict the exact month the system breaks. The Tudor record teaches something colder and more useful than that. When the issuing authority is under pressure, you must separate legal money from stored labor. Those are not always the same thing. In Henry VIII's England, the state could preserve the face of the coin, preserve its legal status, even preserve the fiction of continuity. What it could not preserve was the coin's integrity once it chose to raid the measure itself. And once that happened, anyone holding too much of his life in that compromised unit absorbed the loss slowly. Then suddenly, the people who suffered most were not reckless speculators. They were ordinary earners who trusted the official instrument for too long. The people who adapted first with the ones who understood that political promises are not the same as incorruptible value. The Tudor debasement ran from 1544 until its formal reversal under Edward VI in 1551. But the economic damage and mistrust outlived the proclamation that ended it. That is the tangible pivot. When a government can multiply the units, alter the backing, suspend redemption, or politically redefine what payment means, do not keep all your savings inside its reach. Hold part of your life in things the issuer cannot cheaply create, cosmetically recode, or administratively dilute. That can mean productive land, durable tools, inventory, resilient skills, precious metals, decentralized stores of value, or claims on essential real assets. The category matters less than the principle. Own some value that does not depend on the honesty of the hand that prints, stamps, or legislates. Because in every debasement, the final choice is the same. Either you store your labor in promises made by a stressed issuer, or you store it in reality.